In dit videofragment wordt ingegaan op de relatie tussen bankpraktijken en economische crisistijden. Om te zien of er inderdaad een oorzakelijk verband tussen beide aanwezig is, zullen we eens ingaan op de geschiedenis van de Amerikaanse Centrale Bank en haar praktijken in de jaren 20 en 30 van de vorige eeuw.
By the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems, which were swindled into place by ruthless banking interests. At this time, the dominant families in the banking and business world were the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds. And in the early 1900s, they sought to push once again legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So, J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by publishing rumors that a prominent bank in New York was insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would cause mass hysteria, which would affect other banks as well. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together a few years later, Frederick Allen of Life magazine wrote, "The Morgan interests took advantage to precipitate the panic, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed." Unaware of the fraud, the Panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the banking cartels and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission, led by Aldrich, recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark the international bankers needed to initiate their plan. In 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge that the 10 or so figures who attended disguised their names when en route to the island. After this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. Later, Woodrow Wilson wrote, in regret, Congressman Louis McFadden also expressed the truth after the passage of the bill. A world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers, acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. The Fed has usurped the government. Now, the public was told that the Federal Reserve System was an economic stabilizer, and inflation and economic crises were a thing of the past. Well, as history has shown, nothing is further from the truth. The fact is, the international bankers now had a streamlined machine to expand their personal ambitions.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
For example, from 1914 to 1919, the Fed increased the money supply by nearly 100%, resulting in extensive loans to small banks and the public. Then, in 1920, the Fed called in mass percentages of the outstanding money supply, thus resulting in the supporting banks having to call in huge numbers of loans, and, just like 1907, Bank runs, bankruptcy, and collapse occurred. Over 5,400 competitive banks outside of the Federal Reserve System collapsed, further consolidating the monopoly of a small group of international bankers. Privy to this crime, Congressman Lindbergh stepped up and said in 1921, "Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first scientifically created one, worked out as we figure a mathematical equation."
Ja, en de praktijken van centrale banken kunnen niet alleen een crisissituatie uitlokken. De praktijken van centrale banken zullen onvermijdelijk tot crisissituaties moeten leiden. Er is immers nooit voldoende geld in een economie aanwezig om de rente die banken in rekening brengen te kunnen voldoen. En als gevolg van rente op rente groeit de schuldenlast in het systeem exponentieel en is hyperinflatie onvermijdelijk. Rente op rente betekent exponentiële groei en ik zal dat aan de hand van het volgende filmpje demonstreren.
Kleines Beispiel. Auf einem Planeten mit 10 Lebewesen wird Geld in Form von Lederstücken eingeführt. Jeder erhält 10 Stück zu einem Zinssatz von 10%. Am Ende müssen also 110 Stücke zurückgezahlt werden, obwohl es nur 100 gibt. Woher kommt der Rest? Einer muss all seine Lederstücke verlieren, damit die anderen genug haben, um die Zinsen zu zahlen. Weil niemand am Ende ohne Geld dastehen möchte, werden sich also alle bemühen, so viel wie möglich zu verdienen. Doch so sehr sich auch alle bemühen, am Ende wird irgendwo Geld fehlen. Und woher bekommt man Geld? Eben. Der Zins ist deine wichtigste Waffe. Er zwingt dazu, mehr zu produzieren, mehr zu entwickeln, lässt die anderen eigennützig im Wettbewerb gegeneinander antreten und dich als einzigen verdienen. Der Geldbedarf erhöht sich ständig und ihre Abhängigkeit von deiner Bank wird immer größer. Punkt 5. Der Zinseszins. Verzinse die Zinsen. Der Zins hat sie abhängig gemacht. Der Zinseszins bricht ihnen das Genick. Warum? Der Betrag, auf den Zinsen gezahlt werden, erhöht sich mit jedem Jahr um die Höhe der Zinsen, wenn er nicht abgetragen wird. Das heißt, auch die Zinsen erhöhen sich mit jedem Jahr und jeder verzinste Betrag wird immer schneller und schneller anwachsen. Hierzu ein Beispiel. Hätte man jemandem auf der Erde vor 2000 Jahren einen einzigen Cent geliehen, den mit 5% verzinst, was ja nun wirklich ein freundliches Angebot ist, hätte der einem bei ausbleibender Rückzahlung nach 15 Jahren schon 2 Cent geschuldet. Nach 30 Jahren schon 4 Cent. Nach nur 1450 Jahren allerdings schon eine ganze Erdkugel aus purem Gold und heute wäre der einem 286 Milliarden Mal seinen Heimatplaneten aus purem Gold schuldig. Das einzige Problem daran ist, sie leben nicht so lange.
Tja, de centrale vraag is nu: leidt de huidige economische crisis tot hyperinflatie of het ineenstorten van onze economie? In de volgende video zal ik deze vraag proberen te beantwoorden.